everyone, and welcome. I'm Barbara Tien here with Project Kin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to a very special program today. A few weeks ago, I'd been thinking about how to acknowledge the many anniversaries during 2025 of the end of hostilities in World War II and the formal end of the war. And I recognize that for many of us, with ancestors and family members who had fought in that horrific war, that it was important to acknowledge it and important to participate in a variety of ways that would help us in our storytelling about these experiences. I started looking around and I could think of no one better to guide us in that than Jennifer Holik. Many of you will know her for her publication on Substack, Soul Traveler. And in talking to her about this idea for a special event, I started to realize something really important that I had totally overlooked, and that is the challenge of telling the hard stories. Stories always seem to want to be, at least certainly in my family, those happy, successful, wonderful, good bits of goodness. Life isn't really like that. We know that, and yet sometimes those are the very most important stories to tell. Jennifer has been one to look these challenges straight in the eye in ways that are just breathtaking. And I think all of us can learn from those insights. So I am delighted to have her as our speaker today. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Jennifer. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Welcome, everybody. I am going to share a little bit of information with you briefly about military research and talk about some stories and give you some tips on ways that we can share those stories and some considerations when we're doing research, talking to family, or doing the writing. Now, when I spoke to Barbara initially, I come at telling stories through writing. This is what I've been doing for 15 years. Barbara, as we'll talk about, I'm sure when I'm finished, comes at it from other kinds of projects like video, podcasting, and other things. And what I share about storytelling and the way that I do it, you can apply most of this to all of those other kinds of projects as well. So, storytelling is not just the act of creating that story and putting it out through a book or a video or podcast or some other medium. It is soul work. And I will give you an example of that. In 2010, I started a genealogy business. And within 2 years, in 2012, my life had exploded. I was getting divorced. I moved out. And my ancestors started coming to me. And actually, I had already published one book about my cousin Robert Brauch, who was a flying tiger. It was a bucket list thing. And when I did that, all my other ancestors who died in war said, well, then I need you to tell our stories. And you need to figure out how to do it because everybody thinks the record's burned in 1973. One of the ancestors that stepped forward was my cousin James Provoznik, who died during the Battle of the Bulge. And he showed up over a weekend in 2012, right before Labor Day. And 4 different people contacted me about him that weekend, like a 4-day period. And I had not really looked at James's life or his military service yet, even though I had his death file, I had information, I had not gone there yet, but he showed up. And if that is not a sign that I was supposed to do that and take a journey with him, I really don't know what was. So I did his research. I wrote a book called Stories of the Lost, in which I incorporated Robert's story and then 3 other family members. One of those was James. And then after writing research books on how to do research, I went to Europe for the first time. And this is me on the 1st of May, 2015 at the Luxembourg American Battle Monuments Commission Cemetery by James's grave. We took his burial flag, which I was the first person to ever take out of the box after it was sent to his mother. We flew it over the cemetery. That's something that you can do if you contact the cemetery before your visit. We put Omaha Beach sand on his grave so I could take a photograph of it and read what was there. And I donated his book to the cemetery. The next day, I got to walk in the woods where he was killed because I had connected with a Luxembourg couple who honored the 90th Division in which he fought. James was also an ancestral spirit guide since 2012, and he stayed with me almost until 2020 when our mission was complete. And he really helped guide me into meeting new people. He helped navigate things from the other side to help me meet the man named Johan who lived near Amsterdam, who would become my husband. He passed away in 2012, but that was a whole other adventure. So this is and can be very deep soul healing work that can trigger a lot of things for you to look at. And again, that journey is all by choice. We can choose to look at those things or we can choose to put them away. And something important about that journey is sometimes it takes a very long time. You might start as a genealogist 30 years ago, and you may still be trying to process one of your ancestor stories, and you're not quite ready to tell it in whatever format you want to. And that's okay. It's totally okay. So the military research process, I just want to give you a really quick overview of this. And if you want to know more, feel free to reach out to me. I did develop a two-part strategy to research any veteran from World War I to Vietnam, even if the service file burned in the St. Louis fire in 1973. You basically do research in two parts. Part one is obtaining the service file. And if they died while in service, there's also a death file. And putting a timeline together, obtaining some records like muster rolls and morning reports to help find the footsteps of your service member. And then from there, part two is actually getting unit records and histories and things like that to help you put your service member's service into context and understand what it is they went through, which then impacted who they became after the war, how they raised their family, and probably some of that inherited trauma that got passed down. And I can give you an example of that, actually. I had a client several years ago who contacted me not long after his father passed away. And he said, you know, I was angry and I hated my father most of my life. He was an alcoholic, he was abusive, he was emotionally withdrawn. And we did the research, okay? And we discovered that his father actually helped liberate one of the concentration camps. Once we understood that and understood more about the rest of his service, the son started having all of these different emotions, things like shame, guilt, a little bit of anger at himself for not knowing, not seeing who his father was, what he'd been through. But we have to remember, most veterans never talked about it. Maybe we hear whispers, maybe we find something when they've passed away. So that creates an opportunity for us to heal. Now, I sent Barbara a PDF of my military service questionnaire, and she was going to post it with the notes for the program later. If you want to download that, it has everything you need on there to start locating information about your veteran, which will help if you do start doing research. So be sure to watch for that. You also want to go through every record that you find with a fine-tooth comb. And one very important thing to remember is when you're looking at a service member's discharge, or you're looking at the death file or their grave, there's a unit there, like a final unit. That's probably not the only unit in which he served, though, or she served. Most veterans went through multiple units, from training all the way through being overseas. And there were a lot of reasons for this. And it's very important that you do the homework instead of looking at a discharge paper or a grave like James Pravaznik's, which said 358th Infantry Regiment, and saying, well, I'm going to go research that. That's his story. If I had done that 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago, I would have had all of James's service history wrong except the last 14 days of his life. So you have to reconstruct the service. And even if you have a full service file that didn't burn, you still have to reconstruct the service, create that timeline, do a little writing to see where the holes and the questions are, because even the service file is just one piece of the puzzle. It will not give you the whole context of somebody's story. Now, as I said, I tell stories through writing primarily, although when I teach, when I speak, I throw in a lot of stories from my own projects, my own family, and different clients that I've worked with. One of the things that I invite you to do today, if you're open to it, is connect with your ancestors and allow them to assist in the research. They are just waiting for us to connect with them. And a lot of people call this genealogy serendipity. They'll be like, oh, well, my ancestor said or I had a feeling I should look at the next page on that microfilm, or I should go find this book, or I should have lunch with this person at this conference. And then a connection is made. But what if it's really your ancestor working from behind? This is my great grandfather, Joseph Kokoska. Never met him. He died when my mom was little. But in 2012, also with my cousin James, he showed up, and Joseph basically told me, you have 40 years of repressed emotions, and you can be a serial killer, or you can learn how to do this research. You can write the stories, you can tell the stories, help others, and always tell the truth, even if it hurts. So I don't think I look great in orange. I look fabulous in red, though. So I decided to be a military researcher instead of a serial killer. And here we are, more than 20 books later and a lot of other things. But that choice really pushed me to do my inner work, look at my family, look at myself, and do a lot of healing. When we write or we create anything, the story has to come first, and it's really important to remember and not judge ourselves. But the thing that we create, and in this case, we'll say a story or a book, it's as good as the stories and information that you have at the time that you are finished with it or that you're working on it. New things tend to surface, and I'm going to show you an example of that. But write or create it anyway. Okay. If you want to go back years later when you find another piece of the puzzle and change something, go for it. Also, remember to write without judgment. It's very easy for us to sit here in 2025 and look at something that our ancestor did during the war and sit in judgment on them, or just feel ashamed of them, or whatever emotion is coming up. But we need to keep in mind that we weren't there. We weren't experiencing it. We didn't have whatever beliefs they had. And we don't know the 100 different choices they made before they made the one that we are sitting in judgment of. So explore their life through the historical lens, right from your heart, and try to let the judgment go. Okay. It's a really good idea before you start writing or creating your podcast or your film to actually do some research. Listen to your family stories. They tell all genealogists this, right? And write down all the different stories that you hear. But then you need to check the accuracy. And you really need to sit with the cognitive dissonance when it shows up. I had last year, a producer from the BBC and History Channel contacted me. They were producing a documentary for the 80th anniversary of D-Day last year. And they had an oral history of a man who said he fought at D-Day on Omaha Beach that was posted on the National World War II Museum's website. They wanted to verify his service because he gave a very compelling oral history about his experience on Omaha Beach. Well, we did the research and we found out he lied. He never, throughout his entire World War II service, left the continental United States. And on D-Day, he was actually in New Orleans at training. Now, that's an extreme example, but I've had a lot of people come to me and say, oh, my dad said he fought on Omaha Beach and he was wounded and all of this other stuff happened. And we get the records and we find out that it's mostly not true, or some of it's true, but not all of it, or there are grains of truth. And the client then sits with this cognitive dissonance of, well, my dad would never lie to me. Well, everybody lies, okay? There are a lot of reasons why we tell the stories that we do and why we omit things or we embellish. Veterans were human as well, and there were a lot of reasons that they told the stories that they did. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But you need to do the research and you need to then sit with the results of that based on what you've heard from your family or from the veteran themselves. Create a timeline of service so that you know what happened, what unit somebody was part of, where did they go, map their footsteps or the ships they were on and the journey that they took. Think about including those civilian stories. As I'm writing a story about my grandparents' World War II experience and how I was living it with my late Dutch husband, I think it's important to talk about my grandmother and her life at home. and the things she went through and what she also experienced after the war, after my grandfather was committed to the Veterans Hospital for schizophrenia. What happened to the family, the civilians after that? What happened to them while they were at home waiting? All of that contributes to who we became as we were raised. Also, try to locate things that you might use in your projects like film, photographs, final records for recordings, and then analyze and cite your sources. Please, please cite your sources, whether you're planning to share this with the world or not, because you will find when you start working with a lot of different resources, like right now I'm writing a book for a client about their World War II fighter pilot. I have newspaper articles. I have his oral histories that he did. He gave oral histories on video. I have family letters. I've got military records. I've got all of these things. And sometimes those things conflict. Or I think, wait, he said this in an oral history. Where did I find that? I need to go back and look at that again, listen to that again, compare it to what I have. But if I don't have my source, I can't do that. Now, when we think about how long it takes to write a story, or the fact that maybe the family stories are sort of true, not true, all true, my cousin Frank Winkler is a good example of this. Now, when I was a baby genealogist in 1996, my grandmother told me about our family members who served and died in war. Frank Winkler was one of them. The family story went that he served with the 29th Division. He came ashore on D-Day. He received head wounds that day, died a few weeks later of those head wounds. And he was also in reconnaissance. And also, when his family had his remains returned to the US, they did not think it was him in the casket. Now, as somebody back then, I was like 26 or something, 25, I don't know. And my grandma was in her early 90s. I knew nothing about military research. I knew nothing about graves registration and how they took care of our war dead. I thought, how could they not know that it was him? But I wrote it all down, right? Well, in 2010, I discovered something called an individual deceased personnel file. And I got that file and I started researching Frank, and this outlined information about his death. I also contacted a historian for the 90th Division or the 29th Division and said my cousin was in the 129th Infantry. That's what's on his military issued grave. And the historian said, no, it's wrong. So even if something is written in stone, doesn't even make it true, right? We didn't know why it was wrong, though. According to his morning reports and his death file, his service file had burned. Frank actually was put into the 29th Division, 115th Infantry Regiment on 23 June. He was a replacement soldier. He didn't fight on D-Day. He came in, and within 24 hours, he was killed, gunshot wound to the right lobe. What I learned several years later is the reason his headstone was wrong. Ancestry had digitized these, I don't know, around 2015, 16, somewhere in there, long after I'd published my book. Even though I did have the right information, Frank's father put the wrong information on the headstone app, and the government normally check those really closely, and they failed in Frank's case. Now, I published that book in 2014. I talk about Frank in a lot of my programs. I assumed, because I had no other information, that he was probably a rifleman being thrown in as a replacement because the 29th lost so many soldiers from D-Day through the month of June. But National Archives has been digitizing the Army morning reports and rosters. And just last week, I thought, I'm just going to go see if I can find anything, because the morning report that told us Frank was coming into the 29th didn't say where he came from. So I had no idea what replacement depot or what other unit he'd been transferred in from, so I could research him backward. But I found it last week. I now know, and I could reconstruct his entire service. And that file that I found also told me that he had an MOS or job of 636, which was intelligence. So most of the story that my grandmother told me was actually correct. It just took me almost 30 years to really put it all together. So sometimes those answers come very, very slowly. Also, if you're wondering why they didn't think it was him when they brought his remains back, after World War I and World War II, when you died during those wars overseas, you're buried over there until the war ended. It was about 1920 And late 46, early 47, after World War II, before the government started asking families if they wanted to repatriate the remains. So Frank was buried 4 years overseas before his remains ever came home. So if they had actually opened the casket, they would have discovered nothing but bones and a uniform. When I wrote his story in my book, I wrote it as if I was having a conversation with his parents in 1948, explaining to them what I found in his death file, why they didn't get personal effects back. So there are many ways that even with the limited information that you have, that you can tell those different stories. Now, the research and the storytelling that you do might help solve a mystery. There's an organization called DPAA. It's a government organization that helps identify our missing from World War II all the way to current wars. In September of 2016, I was at Margraten, the American Battle Monuments Commission cemetery in the Netherlands, and I was standing. This grave is actually Wrangel. I was visiting him for a friend. She wanted a picture of his grave, and to the left of his grave was an unknown. And Johan at the time had touched the grave to pay his respects. Johan also had adopted a couple of graves in that cemetery that we have visited. But when he touched that unknown soldier's grave, he kind of jumped back and he's like, you need to touch this grave. Now, I'm empathic. I channel ancestors. I feel the energy of places. I can hear people on the other side, sometimes see them, smell them, a lot of different things. Well, when I touched that grave, the soldier felt very angry, very upset. So I went into the office and I requested the X file, which is the death file number for that unknown. And normally they don't give that information out because DPAA doesn't like it when a lot of people go digging around and trying to solve mysteries that they're supposed to be doing. But because they knew who I was, they had my books, they gave it to me. And within a couple of days, I had not only that X file that basically said Graves registration identified the soldier as this man named John Gordon, but I also had John Gordon's IDPF as well. Now, sadly, John lived only about 30 minutes from me up north in Winnetka in the Chicagoland area. Graves registration identified him all except for one tooth. And because he had no civilian dental records, when Graves registration called his home, his widow was out and his mother basically said, unless you can positively identify him, we never want to hear from you again. So Graves registration could have identified him, but didn't because of one tooth, and they buried him as an unknown soldier. Well, I reached out to some family members on Find a Grave who had posted about him. And I said, look, I've got these files and I really believe that this is him. Would you like them? And has anybody in the family submitted DNA? And the gentleman told me that somebody that was a closer relation than him, but I sent him the files and I wrote about it on my websites. And I've been contacted about them. And then after 2019, because that was my last visit to Margraten, Graves registration, well, DPAA finally disinterred John, and he was positively identified and reburied in Wisconsin in 2022. So the research and the stories you write might help identify somebody who is long gone. I will say, though, it is very sad that they did not identify him because I've seen files where Graves registration hold an identification for an airman who was burned after a crash. No identifying features, no fingerprints, no dog tags, nothing. And there was no DNA back then, but yet they gave him an identification. And it's probably not even him. So this makes me sad that that happened, but I'm grateful through some of my storytelling and my investigative skills that he was able to be identified. It's a good idea to create an outline. I like to use that timeline of service I create, which I've put information in and footnoted already to use as a foundation for a story. And then I like to look for other things that can give me information. Now, this might hit you a little differently than watching an oral history on the National World War II Museum's website or some other website. This is John Long. He was part of the 99th Infantry Division, and he was killed on 13 March 1945 at the Remagen Bridge. His son hired me years ago, and he actually sent me a piece of the Remagen Bridge. And then I think it was 2018 or 19, I actually got to visit what was left of the bridge. And in the information that he sent me, he also sent some sound recordings. Now, did you know during World War II at the USO clubs, they had a station set up for service members to go and record a message to their loved ones on a vinyl record album and then send that home? Well, this client had some, and I just want you to take a listen to this man. It hits differently listening to this man. And I'll tell you, when I first heard this, I was sitting at my kitchen working on his project and listening to this, and he felt very familiar. And I just sat there and cried listening to his voice. But just think of how you might use this in telling the story of your soldier if your family has anything like this.
A good way, but the corporal told us to prepare for a long journey. So don't worry about me, I'll be all right. And I hope you are. Be okay too. And until you hear from me, why, take care of yourself, and well, that's about all. Well, I will close wishing you all the happiness in the world. Sincerely yours, Private John H. Long.
That still makes me want to cry. And I just think if I was lucky enough to have anything like that from my grandfather, who died in that veterans hospital after living there for 17 years, I don't know. I think it would open up something inside me. I'd probably crack wide open. So look for things. I bet a lot of you have things like this within your family archives, and you might not even realize what it really is. So I would invite you to take a look at things like that. Another thing, this is Robert Brock, My Flying Tiger. When I wrote his book in 2011, and then I put it in my book, Stories of the Lost, I have written about him on multiple websites and different articles for different publications. I talk about him when I teach. And that act and the things that we put on Substack as well might bring a family member you've never heard of to your doorstep that says, hey, I've got this. This belonged to him. It was passed down from his father to my father to me, or it came through the family through cousins or some other way. I've received a lot of things from Bob's life. And I'll tell you just a little bit more of his story before I show you this. When Robert came home from the Flying Tigers, when they were disbanded in July of 1942, he came back to Cicero near Chicago. He became Cicero in Chicago's hometown hero because he had survived being shot by the Japanese. He was fighting the Japanese just about the same time that Pearl Harbor was happening, and he was a big hero. He rejoins the Army Air Corps because the Flying Tigers were volunteers, and he gets stationed in Orlando to train pilots. But before he goes, he is hosted at all the clubs like Rotary and Lions and all of these different events, bond drives at Soldier Field and Western Electric. The company invited him in for a tour, and he met a woman named Virginia Scherer. She was a Hello Charlie girl. She'd won a beauty contest, and she was kind of the face of the company for a year. And they fell in love. Well, they didn't want to be apart, so they got married at the end of November 42. And 3 weeks later, on 19 December 1942, Ginny was sitting on the hood of their car at the Orlando Air Base, watching the pilots come back from Kissimmee, practicing strafing the field a couple hundred feet off the ground. And Bob was in the front of his group, and a Lieutenant Kane was just to his right. Lieutenant Kane's wing tipped Bob's wing, and Bob flipped over and crashed. And Virginia watched her 3-week husband die. 4 months later, when Virginia turned 21, because you had to be, she joined the Women's Army Corps, which eventually took her to Cairo, Egypt, where she served, and she met her second husband. So I also was able to write her story. And honestly, nobody knew what happened to her. But because I had written on a Flying Tiger message board in 1996, remember message boards? 9 years later, she found me. Her grandson saw my post and she reached out. She gave me his war diary and a bunch of other things. And in 2010, when my twins went off to kindergarten, I wrote his book. I did get to meet Virginia. I wrote her story, and she just turned 103 a couple of months ago. But because I've talked so much about Bob and I share his story, in 2020, a family member on the West Coast contacted me and said, I have these 8mm films. Would you like them? And I, of course, said yes. And they were both in color. One is of the Bob Brauch Day Parade they had August 2nd, 1942, and the other is of the bond drive they had in Soldier Field. And if you have media like this, it is so important to get it digitized soon before it dries up and it becomes nothing but snow. But I just wanted to show you this tiny clip out of one of those films. This is Bob on Bob Brauch Day. And I just melt every time I see him because his energy, his beautiful heart and soul just shine right through. And then this could be used in some other kind of project other than a book if I were to do something like that. And there's no audio with this, it's just film. But can you imagine if you were putting together a film or some other storytelling media and you could incorporate something like this? How much joy would that bring the people who are watching? How much might they start to think, you know, I wonder what my family has, what's hidden in the attic, or maybe I need to reach out to another family member and ask. And maybe some of those older family members will see something like this and smile, and it will open up new memories for them. Maybe it will also do just a little bit of healing for them. You never know. All right. So just a few things on maybe writing your story. Think about the perspective from which the story that you're going to tell is told, or the story that you're reading. If you're reading maybe a unit history and it's talking about a battle that your veteran experienced, what is the viewpoint? One thing I like to use as an example is if you have two guys in a foxhole and they're facing forward and the battle starts, one guy turns to his right, the other guy turns to his left. Now they're basically watching two different battles. At the end of that campaign battle, and they give testimony, whose account of that battle is accurate? Well, they both are, because they both fought the battle, but they had different perspectives while they were doing it. So those are things that we need to consider. And then maybe also consider the state of the mind of the person who wrote the reports that you're reading or wrote the family letters. An example I like to use, if you've seen the series Band of Brothers, there is an episode about Foy where Captain Winters is writing his after action report, and it flashes between him at his typewriter and him out on the battlefield in the woods. And you can tell that he is struggling with, how much do I put in here? What do I leave out? And the story does kind of tell you what he chose to leave out. While we will never know that, it's just good to kind of think about that. What might the state of mind been? That said, military reports did have a standard of things they needed to have on there. And some reports, you'll get just that. Other reports, you might learn every clean pair of socks, every hot meal, every time they got a whiskey or rum ration, or an experience in the middle of the night sitting in a tank with the Germans marching down the road, singing and the Heil Hitlering and doing all the things and stopping right in front of the tank, but not seeing it, and then keeping going down the road. You never know what you're going to find in these records. And all of that can help you understand what your ancestor went through. A few other tips: try not to jump around in the story unless you're doing something like a before or a then and now. If you have enough oral history that you could make something like that work. Try not to over glorify your veteran. They were human. Now, we have been kind of programmed over the years that certain veterans are more valuable than others, right? We hear a lot about D-Day. In Europe, they hear a lot about the 101st Airborne. If you go to Europe and you look at all the different monuments and everything, a lot of people will be like, oh, the Airborne won the war. There were a lot of other people that participated as well. We don't hear a lot about the Pacific Theater, okay? It's a lot about Europe and D-Day. That's kind of been the narrative. So people tend to think that those people that participated in those campaigns, events, units are more valuable than others. They don't see the value in the cook or the truck driver or the ordnance guy, the mortarman, the sailor, the Marine sometimes. And this can also lead to why veterans told stories that maybe weren't fully true. If they were a cook, but they really wanted to be the guy with the gun on the front lines, they might not have felt that they were a hero or did enough to help end the war. But without the cook, without the truck driver, without all of those other people, the war would not have been won. So we need to think about that and try to keep things into perspective. Try not to overquote from other sources or things that make it somebody else's work. While this can be helpful, and I'm writing a book for a client whose uncle was a fighter pilot in World War II, and I'm going through a book that somebody wrote about one of the pilots that was killed, and he quotes from Merle Olmsted's histories of this fighter group. And it's mostly other people's words, which in some sense can be okay. In other sense, I don't think it's the best thing to do. If you're going to tell the story, you tell the story, all right? Watch your military lingo, your acronyms, abbreviations, because it is like speaking a whole other language, and not everybody's going to understand that. And then maybe create an appendix or an additional resource or a website if you're producing a film or something else that people can watch or listen to. Maybe you add some different resources there for those people. Also, and Barbara and I were talking about this earlier, some other things to consider is privacy, especially if you're interviewing veterans and you want to tell their stories, or you have a particularly difficult and challenging personal thing within your family to share. How do you maintain privacy? How much do you share? Who do you share it with? And I think Barbara can talk a little bit more about this, but it is something to keep in mind. Also, fact check the stories. We've talked about that a little bit, and then consider the cultural and historical context. So when I wrote Bob's book, I had his war diary, like I said. I did put a disclaimer in the front of that book that said I did remove one particular word that Bob used. At that time, it was a common word to use. Today, we would not use that word in polite society. For the most part, I like to keep veterans' words and the things that they said the way they said them as much as possible, because that's who they were, that's how they spoke. But it's up to you on how you want to handle those kinds of things. But again, look at it through the historical lens. If we change past and how they spoke and what they believed based on our 2025 views, for me, that's not the best way to go. I think we have to keep it in historical context, but each person creating their stories will do it the way they feel it should be done. So you do it the way you need to do it, but just try to keep culture and historical context in mind when you're creating your project. Also be transparent about who participated in it, especially if you're using somebody else's words in a war diary. Maybe you're going to attribute the authorship, in this case in a book, to author with the person that they're quoting most often. Also consider the diversity of perspectives. This again is a little bit about historical context, but also maybe some of the triggering things within your family history. You may have certain perspectives and thoughts, beliefs about war, trauma, murder, and other aspects that might have been different from what the veteran felt. Unless there's a place for it, try and keep your perspective out of it. If it's appropriate, then absolutely use it. And then always stick with the historical context. And then if you have sensitive topics that you need to share, again, you need to think about the privacy. You need to think about how do you want to share it, especially when it comes to things that relate to war crimes. Now, I'm writing another book for a client whose father was a Japanese POW for 3.5 years. He went through several camps and a couple of hell ships. And if you know anything about the Japanese POW experience, you know it was horrific, worse than the Germans, I think. And so it's been a balance of how much graphic detail do I put in this book to give her family context of what her father went through, because this will be a private book, because she does share some of those inherited trauma things and some of the ways that her father was as a result of his experience. So how much graphic information do you put in? Where do you draw the line? And that's something that only you can decide when you're putting your project together. You want to balance truth and emotions. And then I think it's important, and not everybody agrees with this, but tell your family stories, but then show the facts. So in this fighter pilot book that I'm writing for the client, and the fighter pilot did an incredible thing that he did not officially report. And a lot of historians today say he didn't do it, it's all a lie, whatever. The family believes that he did. So when we have a story that we either know isn't quite true, or the records say something else happened, or it couldn't have happened, we have to think about how we want to write that. I think it is important to say, well, my family told me this, but the records showed this. And then sometimes you have to just let the reader decide how they want to feel about it. With the fighter pilot book, we are making it clear that the event was never officially reported. The family believes it happened. We have the veteran telling in an oral history why he didn't report it, and we're going to leave it up to readers to decide how they feel. We weren't there, so we cannot say for certain that it did or didn't happen. So there are a lot of different ways that you can present that. And then just always be respectful as you are dealing with this kind of narrative. Now, before I wrap up and give you an example of a story that actually for me was very healing as I wrote it, and even as I have been telling it for 13 years, something the genealogy and military community don't talk about when we are investigating this painful time in our family's history and the things that might be triggering to us, or the inherited trauma that we feel, is something about compassion fatigue, grief, loss, and self-care. Now, I only put this together because in 2018, my husband Johan in the Netherlands was very, very sick. Actually, right after I met him, he was diagnosed with a couple kinds of cancers. And a lot of people would say, well, why did you continue the relationship on 2 different continents? I also had young kids and I had a business, and it was a lot, but it was a soul journey I had to take. Johan was also 14 years older than I was, and his parents were young adults during World War II in Rotterdam. His father was taken for German forced labor, and his mother survived the hunger winter. So there's a lot of World War II trauma there. His mother also carried that through on the other side, and she came through often to see me to try and heal and to pass information to her son that she needed so that she could heal on the other side. Well, Johan, after his treatment, just got sicker and sicker. It was not a matter of was he going to get healthy, because that was never going to happen. It was, when is he going to die? Am I going to be here when it happens? How's it going to happen? I didn't have words for all of these things I was feeling. And then in October of 18, he got so sick, he went in the hospital, and I thought he was going to die, which led to a whole kind of breakdown because I had no idea how to do all of that in a foreign country. A friend of mine who had taken care of her husband for many years before he died said, you're dealing with compassion fatigue, caregiver fatigue, and anticipated grief. He's going to die, you just don't know when or how. And she gave me a TED Talk to watch, which I need to give Barbara the link for that. I meant to do that. In this TED Talk, this woman is talking about compassion fatigue, caregiver fatigue, and she tells the first story is about a Marine Corps chaplain in Vietnam who basically coined the term compassion fatigue after realizing, listening to the Marines' stories when they came in out of the jungle, was creating a little bit of PTSD and exhaustion and grief and anger and all of those emotions in him. And at that point, it kind of hit me, in a sense, I have been a caregiver for my clients doing this deep military work, all of the soldiers that I've researched, and even my family, to help explain that to them. So I'm dealing with compassion fatigue, not only from the research, but also from the life experiences going on. And then a year later, I did my first genogram and realized I was living my grandparents' World War II trauma, especially my grandmother's, with my Dutch husband. we were kind of living a lot of that out. I also realized early on, when I walked in the woods where my cousin James was killed in 2015, I felt enormous grief. And I've always kind of walked around and said, how can you love somebody so much that you never met? Because I felt so much love for him and my great grandpa Joe. It's all kind of tied up together, and it can really do a number on you. And then add in the inherited trauma, and you have all that decontextualized grief and fatigue and all this. It may trigger PTSD that might not even be yours, that you're kind of living out for somebody else. So I think it's important to be aware of this and take breaks, get some self-care, do whatever you need to do to not drown in the research, not drown in the storytelling, not drown in the healing of it. And if you want more information about that, you can reach out to me and I can tell you a few other things. Related to this, I did send Barbara some links to add with the notes for this program. On my World War II Research and Writing Center website, I do have highlighted, which I did send to Barbara, a few articles about service members that died in the war. And you can read the article, and you can also download their death file so that you can read the family letters and you can understand more about the pain the family was feeling. Okay. You will also hear from the Seder and the Walby stories about women who spoke up. Now, if you're researching the women in your family tree, when we think about, and maybe we didn't, I didn't really think about it until I started reading more of these death files and realizing, men got a lot more information than women did. Women often opened their letters with, I'm sorry to bother you. I don't want to be a bother. I know that you're very busy, but could you please? And it was very meek and submissive, except in a few, like Walby and Saders. So read those if you're interested in hearing how some of these women spoke up. And kind of connected to that, when we do this work and we're doing our healing, and we think about the identities that we've assigned some of our family members, like my World War II grandma, I used to think she was very meek and submissive because my uncle, who she lived with, was like the king of the hill and he knew everything and everybody else was kind of stupid. But years after she died and after I started having children and started writing to her in my journal and having conversations like, how did you do this with 3 boys? And then my dad came along and grandpa's in the hospital the rest of his life and you're a single mom, but you're still married. And how did you do it? And I realized she was not weak and submissive. She was really strong. So as you do this work and you work on yourself as well, you're going to notice the identities you've assigned people in your family will change. There's also several articles I've written on my website as well that talk about the mentally destructive side of war, the mental health, and how we carry it through the generations, how we deal with that. So if you're interested, there's 10 years worth of articles and things to consider, research techniques, all of that on that website. Some of this I have brought over to Substack, but just a few selective things. Now, as we wrap up, I would like to read you the end of my great-granduncle Michael's story. Now, Michael Kokoska was the brother of my great-grandpa Joe Kokoska, my spirit guide, my ancestral spirit guide. And he and his father, also Joseph, helped me write this story. Now, when we write a story or we tell a story, you can do it from so many different perspectives, so many different ways, right? In my book, Stories of the Lost, I told you I wrote Frank's story as I was sitting down and talking with his parents. When I put Robert's story in there, it was more of a straight biography. I was trained as a historian, and my first book was very biographical and a little bit dry. If I did it again now, I would never write it that way. But it was my first book. I also put James Provoznik's story in there, which had a lot more information. And then Michael's story. Michael fought in World War I. And when I wrote his story, I wrote it from his father's voice, Joseph, then Michael's voice, and then after Michael is killed, his father's voice. And this is his father speaking to you. And when I wrote this, I did a tremendous amount of healing, a lot of crying, a lot of research. and a lot of listening to my ancestors to put this together. So it kind of brings everything in, and then also helps set me on a path with my business and helping other people. So here we go. It's May 27th, 1921, and I wait on the platform at the rail depot listening for the deep, thunderous rumble of the train coming down the track. Although there are many people waiting for this train and their dead soldiers, I feel isolated from them, alone and invisible. A slight breeze caresses my cheek as if to say, hello, you're not alone. The skies are cloudy and dark as if the heavens are preparing to shed their tears along with mine, and I hear a distant whistle, a groan of thunder, and my heart cracking. The train and the pain are close, like a storm about to explode in the sky. Today is the day my son arrives back from the war. He arrives not walking off the train, but carried off in a flag-draped casket. Dead almost 3 years now and buried in a foreign land. We did not know where he was buried for almost 2 years after he was killed. This was the land his mother and I left years ago. How ironic he should die there when we came here to give our children a life of hope, plenty, and most importantly, peace. The clouds gather close as the train arrives, slowly grinding its brakes as it grinds pain into my heart. And finally the train comes to a stop. My heart stops too for a moment. The doors open in front of me as if in a dream, and soldiers march in formation off the train and stand guard in a present arms state outside the baggage car doors as the families wait silently. Breaths are held as we await the unloading of our soldiers, and I see tears silently sliding down the faces of some of the women as they place their hands on their hearts and bow their heads in solemn prayer. I feel their pain and my chest aches. It's becoming more difficult to hold back the tears. The grief I first felt when I learned of Michael's death has returned with a vengeance. It is as if the storm brewing in the air is brewing inside me, just waiting to be released. The grief consumes me as it explodes once again in my aching chest. Sadness seeps from me through the air to the boxes holding the caskets which carry the soldiers. Can they feel my pain? It's so real, you can almost touch it. Box after box is carried off the train, and soldiers appear carrying my son. They place Michael's casket gently on the floor next to the other boxes, which are laid side by side in the train station lobby. The soldiers await orders on where to transport the boxed caskets from here. The grief of all the men, women, and children standing in this room, waiting to sign for their soldier, is thick and oppressing like high humidity, and I can hardly breathe. I wonder how long this pain will last. I sign the receipt of remains for my dear son and give directions on where the casket should be delivered. I turn to depart the train station and leave a piece of my heart behind as I go. The next day, our dear son was laid in state at home in our parlor. His mother and I waited so long for this moment. Visitors file into our home throughout the day on May 28th and pay their respects. There is no laughter in the house today. The grief filled the room. It's something we could not have avoided no matter how hard we tried. May 29th, 1921 arrives, and soon it will be time to bury our son. It's a beautiful day, fair, sunny, and warm, and a white carriage stands in front of the house. The street is filled with family, friends, and neighbors, and men from all branches of the service enter the house to remove his casket. They load it into the white carriage, and a military band leads the solemn procession down 18th Place from our house. We follow the carriage in more than 12 cars and make our way north to Bohemian National Cemetery, where a full military burial service is held. The white carriage stops next to the area where Michael will be buried, and a military chaplain awaits us. An honor guard acting as pallbearers gently extract his flag-draped casket from the carriage and carefully laid it next to the open hole, which will serve as his final resting place. The chaplain begins speaking, although I hear very little of what he has to say. My thoughts rest on my dear son lying quietly in the casket at my feet. The chaplain finishes speaking, and a group of riflemen fires a salute. After the boom of the guns, an eerie silence descends upon us all. Then the mournful sound of a trumpet and taps is played. The family gathers close, and sadness washes over us like an ocean wave. When taps is finished, the deathly silence envelops us all as the flag which covered Michael's casket was taken off and folded very precisely. With her heart shattering and head bowed as her tear-filled eyes are fixed on his casket, his mother weeps, the tears staining her cheeks. She raises her head and looks at the soldiers standing before her with Michael's flag. She stretches out her arms to receive it, then pulling it close to her heart, she bows her head again and sobs, knowing she will never again hold her son. We say our last goodbyes as Michael is lowered into the ground and finally laid to rest. Maybe now that he is home with us, the pain will begin to subside. Maybe now we can all find some peace and begin to heal. The last of the dirt is placed upon the grave and people begin to depart. Our family stands there a bit longer to reflect on our dear son and his sacrifice, which allows us to live free and in peace. We are proud of our son and his service. As we walk away, I turn one last time to say goodbye to Michael. He was named after Michael, the archangel patron of protection and love. And our son now lies near a tall monument with a statue of an infantryman standing guard, protecting us all. Anybody want to take a breath?
That was beautiful. Just
Thank you.
just extraordinary. Thank you so much. Wow. Do you have a few moments for questions?
Oh, yeah.
I think it's hard to gather thoughts. I think for all of us have memories of having participated in these kinds of ceremonies. For me, it was most recently in 2014, and yeah, yeah, it was incredibly moving, incredibly moving. Kathy, see you taking mute off. Go ahead.
I don't have a question. I just wanted to say thank you. That was just beautiful. And you've have me feeling my some of my ancestors that we don't know very much about, but what has happened to them, mostly World War One. My World War II guy, we know where he is. He's passed. We know where he's buried in the field of honor and where he belongs. But thinking of my the one I'm trying to investigate more, I have a great uncle who was taken prisoner by the Germans in World War One, and we have just a little snippet of a story about his experience. And I've been trying to find out more about him. His older brother was killed in World War One at Gallipoli, and when you talk about bringing them back, he's buried there. He's
Right. The
buried
British
in
did not do
Gallipoli, and
that.
there's a massive monument for the battle. So it's probably a wonderful place for him to be. But I do think about his mother, my great grandmother, and how she felt that he never came back to her at
Yeah.
any point. And so,
Yeah.
thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah,
Beautiful.
that's one thing the British decided is they were not going to repatriate. And I guess in a sense, because of the Commonwealth and the empire was spread across the globe, that would have been an enormously expensive logistical undertaking.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think that's why they decided not to do that. So there are British cemeteries. You walk around Europe, you'll be driving down a country road and up pops one in the middle of a farmer's field.
Yeah.
So they are sacred places.
Hmm.
Yeah. Jennifer, go ahead.
Yeah. Um, I'm just a little bit shaky and speechless after hearing that, but it was just absolutely beautiful.
Thank you.
Just when you mentioned the British in war graves around Europe, I've got family members all over Europe in war graves. And as you said, none of them were ever brought back. After hearing your stories there, I just think I've never really thought about it from the family's point of view. When I'm writing something, I'm writing it more from the point of view of the person that was lost.
Mhm.
And it just makes me stop and think. And as a mother who's lost a child, but has him here, what must it have been like for them, for their children not to be coming back, and for them, in a lot of cases, not to really know where they were buried. you know.
Right. And so a couple things, those articles that I shared with Barbara that she'll be posting, when you read those death files, you really get a sense of what the families went through, because they were told the bare minimum. Although let me make a note, there is one I should share with you that I didn't put on that list. And I'll send you the TED Talk also. I meant to do
I
that
think I
earlier.
found the TED Talk. Is that Juliet Watt? That sound right?
I
Okay,
don't
we'll compare
think
notes. It's
so.
fine.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Those death files, they do provide information, and the British also have death files, by the way, for World War I and World War II. And in America, if you lost somebody in World War I, it's a World War I burial file. It's in St. Louis at the National Personnel Record Center. If it's World War II, Korea, Vietnam, or more current wars, it's the individual deceased personnel file, which is linked in those articles that I shared. So you can get those and take a look at how did the family deal with it, or how did they not deal with it. Some people, in one of those articles that I wrote, the parents or the father ended up in a mental hospital because he couldn't handle the grief. Some of the mothers said, I don't want the personal effects because I can't handle this. I don't want his body back. So you have all of those different emotions, and I think when we taught genealogy and military research, it's more about go find the records and go find the facts, but not really what did the people at home feel and experience.
Yeah.
I wanted to echo the further thought about telling the difficult stories. We talked a little bit about that, and as I think every now and then I reflect back on what I'm doing here. And a lot of times for me personally, a lot of what motivated me to do all of this with respect to Project Yin is around an appreciation that there are very important stories that need to be understood. They need to be told. They need to be digested, understood. And it's difficult to do those in public. There are lots of ways in which we can now, in ways we couldn't do in the past, acknowledge their truths. There are a lot of truths that were just not discussed then, as well as acknowledge, it's not always heroic, just right that alone, never mind who they actually were as human beings. And I want to empower families everywhere to be able to tell these stories, these deeper stories, tell their truths as they know them. And gosh, Jennifer, there are layers in here. This will be a
So many
program to be
layers.
watched over and over again. And I know all of you will join me in thanking Jennifer for these contributions, and really see what you've written now at Soul Traveler, your Substack, and also your books and publications, and your personal site with new eyes and new appreciation. Truly, thank you. Thank you again. All righty, why don't we bring the program to a close there, and know that the discussion continues. As always, feel free to drop the comments in to the recording as it is shared. And with all of these, I think this is the kind of program that will be especially valuable to share outside even of this immediate community, for people to see and have new appreciation for the kind of work all of you are doing with their own families. Yes, thank you, Bill. It was indeed quite extraordinary. Thank you.